because I'm so passionate about the work of climate change and particularly so passionate about climate justice because the intersectionality of race and gender and class um, cannot be ignored when we think about how we're going to address the climate issues. Um, I'm famous at Audubon for saying to people, if you aren't doing climate justice, then you aren't doing climate work. And so we're going to talk today about this is kind of going to be like an overview of what the intersectionalities are. This is a complex discussion. Like we could have many webinars and talk about all the different aspects of intersectionality. So in the time that we have, I'm going to co-cross some of the ones that I think are most common. We're going to have some definitions, but also some time for reflection. And I'm hoping some time for conversation as well, because no one wants to be talked at for an hour, right? Okay, so as Jessica said, I'm Nia Keith. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers, and my title is Climate Change Education Manager. I am coming to you from Andover, which is the traditional unceded lands of the Pennacook people. And before we go any farther, I want to take a moment to talk about why I am taking a moment to do a land acknowledgement. The space we're meeting in tonight is virtual, but the spaces that we're all physically in every day, the spaces that we physically live and work in, are within traditional, contemporary, and unceded territories of many Indigenous people. Environmental movement has traditionally ignored and even stolen the voices of Indigenous peoples. And environmental problems that we are facing today are directly rooted in a history of colonialism, racism, and oppression. Indigenous communities right now are on the front lines of climate change activism, education, and policy. And it is my opinion that it is very important that we learn to center those voices and opinions when we talk about the climate movement. So to that end, I would like to simply invite anyone who does not currently know the Indigenous land that you occupy to take some time to go to nativeland.ca, and I will put that into the chat at the end because I can't access the chat right now. But you can look at that. It's a fantastic website that will show you a map, and it will show you the Indigenous peoples that have traditionally lived in the land that you're at, and also provides links to current government sites if those peoples have current government representation, and many Indigenous peoples do. There are over 530 Indigenous governments that are acknowledged by the US government. And if all of those lands were added up together, it would be the 4th largest state in the Union. So it's very important that we don't forget that Indigenous people are here and they're active and their voices need to be heard. So now I'd love to have a quick moment for me to just hear who's in the room. So I know there's over 20 of us in the room, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a minute because I'd like to see who is in the room. So if people could just take a quick minute, like 20 seconds really, and just put your name and your preferred pronouns, and then one thing that you are curious about for tonight. So if you would like to change your name, you can. If you hover over your name, you'll see a little ellipsis, which is like 3 little dots, and it'll allow you to rename yourself. If you want to, you can do as I've done and rename yourself with your preferred pronouns. But in the chat, I would love people to write one thing they're curious about that they're hoping they might get answered tonight. So just go ahead and take a few moments to write one thing in the chat that you're curious about. And I'm just gonna take a look. Also, if anybody feels brave and wants to unmute their mic and say one thing that they're curious about, I welcome to hear voices as well. And thank you, Jessica, for putting the Native Land website in the chat for people. They can use that. All right, some curiosities are starting to come in. More information on the interrelationship of climate change and social justice. We're definitely going to talk about that. Wondering how it seems that climate justice is suddenly new. It's been going on for so long. Ooh, is that Burn? I love that question. I love that one because I agree with you. Climate justice has been an issue for people as long as we have had environmental degradation, which is the beginning of time. So it's been around for a long time. So why does it seem like it's so new? That's great. We'll definitely talk about that. What do you think about changing Columbus Day Indigenous Peoples Day at towns versus states, federal levels? Oh, that's an interesting one. I like that. Curious what brought everyone here tonight. Looking forward to checking out that website to learn more about those who lived a couple hundred years ago. And quite frankly, could be living here currently. I was very surprised I had the same idea of like, I wonder which Native peoples lived here, and then found out that the Wabanaki who lived in this area have tribal representation 10 miles up the road from my house. So they still occupy lands nearby. Thought about justice issues a fair amount, but haven't learned enough about the intersectionality. Great. And I love, we have also a director of faith formation, wanting to think about how to bring that into faith. Interesting. Love it, love it, love it. Keep putting things in the chat if you still have stuff to add. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. Okay. So tonight we're going to be talking about some topics that might feel a little bit, there might be some energy around some of these topics. Like we're going to be talking about climate, which for some people can be very emotional. We're going to be talking about race and oppression and racism. There's a lot of energies around that. People can oftentimes find themselves being concerned to speak up because they're afraid to say the wrong things. And so I'm going to invite all of us tonight to agree to hold brave space for each other. And that's a term that I learned from another facilitator. And they taught to me. And the idea is that we don't hold safe space, which we hear common, because sometimes we might feel a little emotionally vulnerable, and that doesn't necessarily feel safe. But being vulnerable is the only way we're going to really get down into the nitty-gritty of talking about these topics and really unpacking them. So in Brave Space, we step up into that space of vulnerability. We bring our authentic selves. I'm going to invite everybody here to be curious as opposed to judgmental. That if you have questions and comments for the group, that we put them out in respectful ways. And most importantly, that when you find a moment of resistance, to take that time to be introspective about what it is that you're resisting against. So just a little bit about Brave Space for us tonight. All righty, let's get down to the basics. We're talking about climate change. Let's just make sure we're all on the same page. This is a definition that I helped write for Mass Audubon's climate team. Climate change is a rapid change in global climate patterns, which is threatening the sustainability of human and natural systems, predominantly caused by human activities that release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The effects of climate change can be reversed through large-scale actions and policies that support natural climate solutions, reduce or eliminate greenhouse gases, and address social and economic disparities. That's a mouthful. What it really comes down to is this. It's warming. It's us. We're sure it's bad, but we can fix it. Okay? And we're going to go through each of those tonight in a little bit. And that sign and those 5 points were actually first came out in 2011 by Professor Kimberly Nicholas, if you're curious. So let's talk about it's warming. You know, if you're here at this call, you probably already believe climate change is real, but there are people who are still kind of saying that they're not sure if it is. Well, we're sure it is. It's warming. In fact, since 1888, they've been keeping track of the hottest days of all the days, temperature days. And between 2005 and 2020, 9 of the 10 warmest years on record have been recorded. 9 out of the 10 warmest years have been recorded in the last 15 years. And in fact, 2019 is the second warmest year on record, according to NOAA. They haven't finished calculating what this year's standing is going to be. Some people are thinking it's possible 2020 could end up in that same group. The point is, it is undeniable. If you look at this graph, you can see that the temperature has been steadily rising. And what I think is really interesting, of course, is that if you take a look post-World War II, you can see that the amount of temperature really jumps, right? It kind of stays a little bit steady for a while when we get into that post-industrial stage, and then after World War II, skyrockets. We've also been seeing the effects of warming here in Massachusetts. So if you look at this, we call this the Migrating Massachusetts Map. You can see the summer index of where Massachusetts traditionally laid, where we geographically are. But currently even, the average temperatures in Massachusetts has gone up by 10 degrees during the summer. So we are no longer even experiencing our traditional summers anymore. We've already migrated south temperature-wise. Now, if we are to take action as has been laid out in the Paris climate agreements, we're still going to see some warming. In fact, you can see according to this map, we're going to be somewhere down there in the Virginia, right? If we don't take the steps laid out in the Paris Agreement and we continue with business as usual, we're actually going to see our temperatures get closer to what they experience in summer in South Carolina and Georgia. And I don't know about you, but one of the reasons that I really like living in New England is because I don't really like to have the hot summers as much. So this is what we're looking at. It's us. So some people will say, you'll sometimes hear climate deniers will say things like, well, global warming and climate change is a natural phenomenon and it's not caused by humans. Nope. We know for certain it's caused by humans. And if there's any doubt, you can take a look at some of these correlations. You can look at this particular graph that shows the amount of carbon dioxide that has been released over time into the atmosphere since 1960. You can see that that goes straight up. We're releasing a lot more carbon dioxide than we have in the past. Now compare that to the map or the graphic that we were just looking at. And if you look at the period roughly around 1960, you can see that same steep incline matches the same incline of the amount of CO2. So the CO2 and the amount of heat are going parallel with each other. There's no denying it. It's warming and it's us. We're sure. Sometimes you'll hear people say like, well, I hear that there are scientists that debate. 97% of the scientific community agrees that we are warming and that if we don't take immediate action within the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to start experiencing catastrophic events. Truth of the matter is we're already experiencing it. If you look at the fires that we've had, if you look at the storms that we've had, we are already experiencing it. But if we don't make some big changes soon, we're going to start experiencing this on a much broader scale than we even have in the past. Now, you will hear sometimes people with a lot of confidence say that they truly believe there are scientists out there that don't believe in this. Well, I did some research on my own and discovered that in the last 20 years, fossil fuel companies have spent over $1 billion on misinformation campaigns to convince the public that what they hear is not true about climate change or the rate with which things are changing. So make no mistake, it's real. We're sure. It's bad. I don't really like to sit around and make people feel horrible about climate change, but the truth of the matter is if people don't understand what we're faced with, people won't understand how quickly we need to act. And we need to act yesterday because things are not in a place where we can wait. Climate change is the largest existential crisis facing humanity. And it's not just facing humanity, it's affecting the whole world. I like to break down climate impacts into 3 different categories: impacts to humans, impacts to infrastructure, and impacts to the environment. So impacts to nature. Impacts to nature can include a lot of things like habitat loss and destruction, and also species can be impacted. The picture you see down there on the bottom of those cute little moose, I think moose are cute anyway. We're going to see a lot less of these cute little moose in Massachusetts because their numbers are sharply declining because of the warming temperatures. Moose have evolved to have cold weather existence, and we are losing our cold weather, which means the moose are being forced to migrate north to find habitats that are suitable to their living. And this is happening all the time in nature. But like humans, other animals aren't always able to adapt or to move. For animals that cannot leave their habitats or cannot adapt quickly enough, they're simply dying out. And we are losing species around the world because of loss of habitat and destruction from storms and erosion and flooding due to climate change. Impacts to infrastructure. So obviously we have all these storm events, we have flood events, the fires that we experienced out west this year, another example of the destructive power of climate change. And in all these cases, we have millions of dollars of damage, not to mention lives that are lost, and people who are displaced from their homes. And what we're going to talk about later on is that not everybody has the same ability to move or recover when these kinds of situations happen to their towns and their homes. For example, there's places in New Orleans that still haven't been recovered from Katrina because there hasn't been the money to help those neighborhoods come back. So we're going to talk about what that means too, why some neighborhoods are able to survive and others are not. But as this gets worse and worse, we're going to see more of these kind of impacts and more people being displaced from their homes. And then, of course, impacts to people. The impacts to infrastructure definitely affects people, but it also affects people in other ways. It affects our health. So as we get warmer weather, we get longer growing seasons, which also means that insects and arachnids have longer seasons to do their thing. There's more of them, and they carry diseases that are making people sick. So you're seeing lots of rises in insect and tick-borne diseases that are spreading, not just Lyme, but we saw the equine, the triple E virus last year that I know affected a lot of places. Even some camps had to close because of the threat of campers getting bitten by mosquitoes. And all of this is going to continue to get more and more dangerous as we have these longer summers. But also the amount of particulate in the air from pollution and the heat trapping that particulate means that people are going to have more respiratory problems. And that's going to become more of an issue. And then, of course, as I had spoke about before, we have flooding and other events that are displacing people from their homes, which is also a public health crisis, because when you're in crisis and you've been moved from your home, you can't access doctors, you can't access medicine, and you might be cut off from other social supports that puts you in jeopardy of injuries or sickness. And not to mention mental health issues as well, because of all the stress that can come from having to deal with these heightened senses of emergency. So I would like us for a second to just do a little thought exercise, okay? Look at this picture, and I want you to imagine that this is your home. And I want you to take a minute to think about this scenario. The storm has been forecasted. You knew it was coming, but you didn't know it was going to be as bad as it was. And as the streets begin to flood, you start thinking, I've got to do something. I've got to get out of here. I've got to get myself safe. I want everybody to take 30 seconds and think, what would you do? And I'm going to ask one or two people to just share with me, if they wouldn't mind. How would you deal with this if this was your home and it was starting to flood? Take a few seconds. All right. Is there anybody who would like to unmic and just share how they would deal with this situation if the flood was coming to their home? Yeah, Felicia.
I'm thinking one of the problems with the way things are going and everything is changing, that I may or may not have any kind of insurance to cover this. Now, life is always the most important thing, but you'd like to have a home to come back to. But now there's more areas being flooded that weren't flooded previously, and this may not be covered. And as a family, my family living in this home, I may be facing a completely life-changing event. It isn't just the damage to my property. I may never be able, like the people in New Orleans, I may never be able to go back to my home.
Thank you.
Find a way to start again.
Thank you for sharing that. So Felicia's sharing that after the flood, there may not be a home to go back to. But I want us to even take a step back and imagine that you're standing in your living room and the waters are just starting to rise. You haven't even, what are you gonna do?
Oof.
Kathy, what would you do?
Well, you know what? I'm not sure. I'm thinking that there's so many things that are, you can't replace, like photo albums and things like that. I don't know. That used to be the thing I would worry about, I think, because I think about this when we get bad storms, and when I've been in New Orleans and seen, what the way they're fixing the houses now and everything. It makes you imagine what people went through. Nowadays, I guess you'd want to take your computer or something. I don't know, but I guess I'd be thinking, how do I get out of here? Can I drive my car through this water? I don't know if that's when you call the police and say, I need a boat. I don't know. It's frightening. I know that in this town, there have been floods along the Merrimack in North Chelmsford, and people have had to deal with this in this town. I often think, well, we're up on a bit of a hill, so we might make it through for the next 10 years, but it is pretty scary to imagine this, and because you'd probably have to go to a shelter and live in a shelter, here it's the senior center, for a few days and sleep on a cot. I don't know, but now I'm beginning to think maybe I need to put together a kit like you do when you're going into labor and you need to go to the hospital. You know, I don't know. Very a scary thing to think about.
Yeah. You brought up a lot of really good stuff, and I wanted to ask this question to the group tonight because as I was making this presentation, I found this picture. I found myself going, man, what would I do if I was sitting in my house and the waters were coming and I realized suddenly that this is going to be worse than I thought. I was like, well, I guess I'd pack up my cat, you know, get my partner together, grab our stuff, see if we could go stay with, you know, friends or family who might not be in a flood zone, and, you know, just hope it all worked out. And then I started thinking, what if I was 80 and I couldn't walk as well? What if I didn't have the money to have a car of my own to just jump into and drive away? What if I was a new immigrant and didn't have a social structure, some people to just go and stay with? And suddenly I was really hit with the intersectionality of all these things. And this is the reality for people on the front lines of climate change. Because all the things that instantly came to my mind are resources that not everybody has access to. And that's what we're going to dig into in a minute. So before we go any farther though, are there questions? Because I just chatted at you for quite a bit.
You've also made us think a lot because I do, you know, when Katrina hit and you saw a lot of older people sitting around the Superdome, and I mean, you couldn't help but empathize and wonder, you know, and some people died sitting on a lawn chair outside the Superdome. And I can't, you know, sometimes it's too much to even think about. And unfortunately, I think that's what happens. People don't want to think about it and just put it out of their mind. And, you know, and they think, and I know I did too. It's, you know, but I've been to New Orleans. So, you know, you do empathize. I think it's very sad.
Anyone have any questions? Ed?
Yeah, I think of why this housing was there in the first place, and I think of environmental justice communities and how they developed to become environmental justice communities. And that has to do with a whole history of exclusion of vulnerable communities to places that are more vulnerable to the climate than others, whether it's by a coal plant or a fossil fuel plant or a river that floods and there's a floodplain. So we're talking about 100 years of history that has resulted, in many cases, the development of housing and communities in areas that become vulnerable and are inhabited by sort of lower income or economically or economic, environmental, or racial justice communities.
Yep. Thank you for bringing that up. It's so important. And even in some communities that are like thought of as being kind of like rich, expensive vacation communities that you'll see in like coastal communities, and people are like, oh, those communities are rich. Those communities are usually rich for 2 months during the summer. And the people who live there all year are usually lower income peoples. And those are the people who have to live through the winter storms and the flooding. So even when we think about some of these kind of like exclusive coastal communities, there's a lot of people there who are on the front lines of environmental justice issues. Any other questions or thoughts that people have at this point before we go on to talk about some definitions? I can't see all the images or chats too, so if Kathy or Jessica, if you see people who have hands up or stuff in the chat, let me know.
Nia, are we sworn to secrecy or confidentiality tonight? Because you mentioned that you'd save your cat before saving your partner, and I just was curious.
My partner knows this. My partner once asked, do you love the cat more or me? And I said, well, you're gonna force the issue. I'm gonna choose the cat. The cat's been around for 15 years. You're fairly much a newcomer at only 8.
I'm glad I asked for clarification.
My cat's a senior. She has mobility issues. All right. Well, let's go on and talk about some definitions. So I want to make sure we talk about two things today, intersectionality and climate justice. So what do we mean when we say intersectionality? Intersectionality recognizes that identity markers like being a woman or being Black do not exist independently of each other. These identities that we have form concentric circles in our lives. And depending on the histories of oppression or access or power or privilege, those concentric circles overlapping can really change the experience you have when trying to deal with climate issues. So the definition I have here is that intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categories such as race, class, gender, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. And then what do I mean when I say climate justice? We're talking about a term, but also a movement that acknowledges climate change can have different social, economic, health, public health, and other adverse impacts on underprivileged populations. People in the climate justice movement are often advocating that we need to strive to deal with the social inequities that exist and not just deal with the environmental impacts. And that is huge. And I know that somebody said earlier in the chat, like, why is it that we talk about this like this is new and it's been there all along? And the truth of the matter is it's been there all along, but like so many other aspects of society, people who are in marginalized positions, their voices are often not centered in conversations. Their causes are often not centered in conversations. And traditional environmental movements have often ignored and even sometimes purposely pushed out the issues and viewpoints of marginalized communities, especially Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so, yes, there's been people who've been talking about this for decades and decades and decades, but it's only more recently that the broader environmental movement is starting to say like, oh yeah, we have skin in this game too. So that's why it seems like it's new, but it's not. So I was saying before that what we're talking about are like all these overlapping identities, and we all have identities and we all have different levels of privilege and power because of our different identities. So I'm gonna ask everybody to just take half a moment to think about what are your own identities. For example, I identify as being a Black, cisgendered woman. I identify as liberal, American, a person who sadly only speaks one language. I also identify as a gardener, an older sibling, and a military brat. So these are all different aspects of my identity that come together in different ways and allow me different access, but also provides different barriers depending on where I am and who I'm interacting with in society. So I'd love everybody to just take a few moments of reflection to think about what are your identities? What are the circles that intersect for you? And can you think of a time where one of the communities that you identify with has faced a barrier because of their identity? Think about all of your identities. And has you ever belonged to a group who has faced a barrier based on your identity? And people can share in the chat if they want to, but if somebody wants to share with the group and unmute themselves, love to hear that too.
I'd be glad to share my experience of watching a recent video called The 13th Amendment. And I, as a white person, was excluded from information about the impact of what we were doing to minority communities. And the 13th Amendment brings that home so clearly. So I put the link to that video in the chat, and I urge everyone to watch it. It's chilling.
Thank you. That's such a really powerful example too, Ed, because I think sometimes people have the misperception that if someone identifies as white, that they don't experience any drawbacks from racism, but racism hurts everyone. And the way you just said that, the fact that like racism robbed you of historical knowledge, robbed you of understanding something about the people around you, is like a really powerful lens. So thank you. Anyone else want to share how one of their identified groups has been impacted by a barrier? Okay. So as I was saying earlier tonight, these intersectionalities are responsible for the impact of climate change falling differently on different communities. And another aspect of climate justice, which I hadn't mentioned before, but I really do need to mention here, is that the sad irony of climate impacts are that the communities and people who are least responsible for the emission of greenhouse gases are the ones who are the most impacted. The communities producing the least amount are the ones getting the greatest amount of impact and effect. So when we say disproportionate, that's what we're talking about. You'll often hear people say that climate change affects communities disproportionately. That's what we're talking about. So I'm going to pull out a few groups for us to look at more closely. And I want us to take a look at how sexism, ageism, ableism, and racism interacts with climate to produce these imbalanced effects on various communities. So first, let's talk about race. Environmental racism, y'all, it ain't new, right? It's been around forever. But some of the facts in here are quite chilling. People of color have 38% higher nitrogen dioxide exposure, and they are significantly more likely to live near a waste disposal plant or a fossil fuel processing plant. They are much more likely to live in communities that have contaminated air, water, or soil. And because of the because of the history of racism and oppression in the United States, communities of color often lack the political and monetary power to push back when governments want to create these new power plants. They almost always end up in communities of color. In fact, they disproportionately end up in African American communities. And so, of course, they're dealing with the increased pollutants in the air, which is causing larger amounts of illness, missed days from work and school, which compounds class issues. African American communities are already more likely to be impoverished than other communities in the United States. So then you compound that with illness from pollutants and from climate change, And then you have people who are missing even more income opportunities. Additionally, people of color are more likely to live in urban communities. Urban communities are much warmer during the summer than non-urban communities. They call it the heat island effect. So in addition to all the things that I had just mentioned around air pollutants and water quality and contaminants, they also are dealing not only with the heat of the summer, but increased heat beyond even what people in non-urban settings are experiencing. And because of traditional ways of designing many cities, especially low-income areas of cities, there's usually very little green space to even retreat to when the heat comes. So it is a multiplying death trap, unfortunately. And as far as environmental justice issues goes, I think we're all super familiar with the experiences that communities of color have been wrestling with. We all know about the issues in Flint, Michigan, which, by the way, have not been resolved. They just have fallen out of the news, but they still don't have clean water in Flint, Michigan. Also, I was shocked even in my own research to learn that all of the high level nuclear waste sites in the United States are all located on Native American lands. All of them. Take that in for a minute. We are dumping all of our nuclear waste site on Native American lands. Each year, the oil and gas industry dumps 9 million tons of methane and other pollutants into the air. The majority of the communities where these factories are located are African American. So the pictures that are in this here are from Flint, Michigan, a nuclear power plant, and then the large picture on the right is a waste burning plant. And then, of course, we have to consider the impact of economics. Class goes across all these things, right? So if you have low income, you probably also have less access to medical medicines, facilities, so that if you do become sick, you're less likely to be able to get the care you need to become better. You're more likely to have long-term effects from the illnesses, and you're more likely to lack the resources to move out of the community. So all of these things compound. Gender. Now, some people might be thinking, how does gender have anything to do with climate change? I mean, like, why does it matter if you're male or female? It's all climate change, right? That's not true. Unfortunately, because again, there has been discrimination based on gender. Women and girls are more likely to be impacted by climate change than men are. In fact, another statistic that I was appalled at, 80% of current climate refugees in the world are women. 80% of climate refugees are women. And women are 14 times more likely to die in a climate disaster event than a man. 14 times more likely. And there's lots of reasons for that. Women are in normal situations more vulnerable to attack and violence. And when emergencies happen and people are displaced from their normal places of safety and refuge, they become even more victimized. So unfortunately, in the case of climate change, when people become uprooted from their homes, it is women and girls who wind up paying with their lives. Also, because women make less money, they're less likely to have the financial resources to be able to make adaptations if they have to move from their homes, or if their homes get flooded and they try to come back, they're less likely to be able to afford to rehab the home to be able to come back in. Women also are often the ones burdened with taking care of children if they are the single parent, and then they have even more economic issues to deal with there. Ability. So ability is a very broad umbrella, and I am not going to pretend that I know all the ins and outs of all the different ways that ability affects a person's resources adapting to climate change. But some things to think about is that when we're talking about ability, we can be talking about cognitive ability, we could be talking about physical ability, but we also could be talking about having experienced trauma. And all of these things can impair a person's ability to respond to a climate emergency or a climate event. So in some cases, it means that they physically might not have the ability to get out of the situation. If there's cognitive or trauma, there might be the ability to even plan for an emergency. You know, Kathy, you were saying that like, maybe I should have like an emergency bag, but there are people who have cognitive abilities that making those kind of plans would be very difficult. And even if somebody does have a plan, they might have some limitations in their ability that would make it hard for them to be able to even utilize that plan in a timely manner. And then of course, on top of it, depending on the kind of ability issues that the person is trying to work through, they may not have the same income resources again. So once again, class can come in to the situation, making it difficult for somebody to be able to respond. Age. So age is interesting because age can affect, can be a huge factor whether you're young or whether you're old. Both ways, it can kind of be a downward spiral when trying to deal with climate. So why are children more vulnerable to climate change? Well, there's a number of reasons. One, their bodies are smaller. So if they are being exposed to toxins like the children in Flint, Michigan, for example, they're going to have those toxins build up in their bodies faster than an adult, which means that if there's going to be illness and sickness, it's going to affect them sooner than it would their adult counterparts. When it comes to air pollutants, they have smaller lungs, and so their lungs are more likely to be damaged, and they're more likely to have lifelong health issues from the pollutants that they encounter as well. Additionally, children are more likely to live in poverty, near or below poverty, than an adult, which means that once again, the whole class becomes an issue. But why are the elderly more vulnerable? Well, some of the things that we talked about in ability comes into play. You know, older adults might be having a reduced mental capacity. They might be having physical mobility issues. Many older adults are on a fixed income and do not have money to deal with emergencies as they come along. Some older adults have decreased immune system capability, which can make them sicker faster. And then, of course, sadly enough, in our society, we often don't support older people as well as we can. And a lot of older people don't have social supports and may be alone and not have anyone to turn to in the case of an emergency. So this was a lot. This was heavy. I basically just told you the world's going to hell in a handbasket. But I don't want you to forget that number 5 says we can fix it. So before we end our conversation, let's talk about what we're going to do to make significant change in the next 10 years so that we do not end up having to deal with catastrophic climate events. So there's 2 kinds of actions that people often focus on when we're talking about how we can respond to climate. And the things that people talk about most frequently are usually individual actions. People talk about things like, you know, ride your bike and, you know, or ride share with people so that you can put less emissions into the atmosphere. Eat a plant-based diet so that, because we have found that red meat particularly, there has been a lot of loss of forest to raise the red meat, and also the cows themselves, emit methane. People also speak about things like putting solar panels on your home, or even following the 5 R's, which is, of course, like refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle. And all of these things, I think, how do I say this delicately? I think that these actions have been popularized because it makes people think, if I recycle, then I've done my part. But those of you, like, you're all into climate issues or you wouldn't be here tonight. So you probably are aware that a few months ago, a report came out that said that 71% of all the emissions that are being put into the atmosphere right now are being produced by just 100 companies. Not 100 companies in the United States, 100 companies in the world. 100 companies out of the hundreds of thousands of companies are responsible for 71% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And the top 10 are all fossil fuel companies. In fact, they are collectively, that top 10, responsible for roughly 14%. Just those 10 companies are responsible for 14%. So if 71% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from just a few companies, then me riding my bike to work is not really the issue we need to deal with. We need to start thinking about taking bigger, more collective action. And so that is what a lot of us in the climate movement are really trying to move people towards, is taking collective action so we can have big change. So some of the things that you can do is join a movement. There are so many amazing climate organizations out there right now that need support, that need financial support, that need volunteer time, that need people to go out in the streets, that needs people to pick up the phone, that needs people to just do administrative work. There's 1,000 different places that you can put your energy into one of these organizations to help them make a change. Another thing that may seem like an individual action, but is actually part of the collective action, is talk about climate change. Studies have shown that although the majority of people in the United States believe that climate change is real, almost no one talks about it, not even to their family and friends. Even people in the climate change field, like myself, rarely actually talk to people about climate change. It's almost like become this like dirty little liberal secret. We're just not going to talk about climate change. I think it's because a lot of people feel depressed about climate change. But the truth of the matter is, I don't find climate change depressing. Not because I don't think it's a big deal, but because I 100% believe it's something we can change. I 100% believe that by taking action today, we can reverse climate change. I know that organizations like Mass Audubon, who are purchasing land that are being used as carbon sinks. I know about organizations like Groundwork Lawrence up in Lawrence, Massachusetts, that are building green spaces in urban centers so that we can reduce heat island effect and also create carbon sinks. That these organizations are doing the things that we need to do to make change. But we also need to make big changes politically. And when I say politically, I mean like policy. This is not about which side of the aisle. This is about just making changes in our policies. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to divest from fossil fuels. We need to encourage the companies that we work for to pull their investments out of the fossil fuel industry. They cannot have money to continue doing what they're doing. I repeat, 14% of emissions, 10 companies, all fossil fuel industries. And something else that I thought about myself recently was divesting my own self from fossil fuels. Like, I've always been working with like making sure that the companies that I work with, I'm like, Mass Audubon, we're all pushing for divestment, which is something we're actively working on. I'm very proud to say. But then I found myself going, I have bank accounts and I don't know what my bank is doing with my money. And most likely they're investing it in fossil fuels because you can make money there. And I did some research and found out that there are actually green banks that you can put your money into that will not invest in fossil fuels. So you can divest your own personal money from the fossil fuel industry by switching the bank that you're in and the investment plans you have. I actually have taken all of my retirement funds. None of them are invested in fossil fuels at this point. So things to think about. Use your vote, and not just your vote during the 4-year presidential election, because that's important. But so many of the impacts that happen to us on a daily basis are actually done by local politicians. Know your local representatives and vote for people who are going to vote for green jobs, who are going to vote for green recovery, that are going to make policies that are going to address issues of injustice and inequity. And if they're not thinking about it, write them so that it's on their mind. And that's what I mean when I say demand change. I think we have to use our voices. You see the example of youth today are just the most amazing example because they're out there marching, they're in the streets, they're calling, writing politicians and saying that they're not going to take any other answer that is not about making change towards climate resiliency. And we all need to take the same stance. And if we can do that, we can make the changes we need to make before we hit that 10 to 15-year wall. So that is the end of my slideshow. I am now open for questions from people. And I'm just going to put this last slide up so I can stop sharing my screen and I can see people. But if you are interested in contacting me or anyone else from the climate team, you can reach out to climatechange@massaudubon.org. Someone did mention that we do have an entire climate team now at Mass Audubon. I'm the educator, but we have a policy and advocacy director. We have a climate communications manager, and we also have a climate adaptation ecologist. And all of us are able to answer questions or do lectures like this, talk to school groups. This is it's our full-time gig. So if you ever want to get in contact with us, that's our information. Mm-hmm. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Oh. Nia, I don't know if you were able to read some of the chat that was coming through, but I think it was Ed Wolf said something that I want to make sure people saw, because when he commented on something you said, and he said, look at the opportunities that climate change creates for us to innovate, change, and work with communities, et cetera. And I think that's the positive part of, I think, your message is that this green recovery that we hope to see is bringing so many opportunities. I mean, there's so many things. I like to believe this anyway, and I see a lot of evidence that there's things just waiting to go online, and the wind turbines and the offshore wind energy, solar, and I just feel like if people will just believe they can do something, that's a big part of it.
Yep. Ed.
Yeah, I'd like to take a moment to give you an example of what I see as a basically regressive practice by the state of Massachusetts. We all know about Mass Save programs, where Mass Save provides subsidies for people to put in insulation or convert to a more efficient gas furnace, or convert from a propane tank to a heat pump. But most of those programs, if not all of them, are taken advantage of by homeowners. And the bill for that gets paid by gas company ratepayers. But those people who are in low-income communities aren't necessarily homeowners. Most of them are renters. They don't have a chance to go ahead and take advantage of those subsidies, but their landlord does. But their landlord just passes the cost of their energy onto them through their leases. So there's no incentive of the landlord to do that. So the Mass Save programs are regressive in imposing greater rate increases on low-income communities because they end up paying for the amount of subsidies that homeowners get to improve their homes. So we're working on this right now in some legislation before the legislatures, House Bill 4933 and Senate Bill 2500. But just please be aware of that. And it's a further way, and also you might not know, the energy bill of a person in a triple decker in Lawrence without insulation with old knob and tube wiring is 3 times roughly what the energy bill is that you pay for in a house that is insulated in suburbia. Because when it gets very cold, they just jack up the heat. So think about what it would take to finance the re-insulation and the change in the knob and tube wiring of those houses throughout Massachusetts. There are about close to 1 million of those dwelling units in Massachusetts. So think of what you would do to combat climate change by getting those people to be able to reduce the amount of their energy usage, which would have a dramatic effect on climate change. That's the challenge, one of the challenges we're faced with. And how the home ownership, which is a sort of a white favored policy or a wealthy favored policy, discriminates against those people who can't afford to do that. Enough said.
Thank you.
Yeah, getting that electricity turned over is probably the most expensive thing we've done on our house. And we had the knob and tube wiring. And yeah, you're absolutely right about that. All of those homes in Lowell and Lawrence, and there's still a lot of them here in Chelmsford too, but you know, it's very expensive. Wow.
And you can't insulate with knob and tube wiring. You have to get that out of the way because it's a fire hazard.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always heard it's not Chelmsford, it's Chelmsford.
Chelmsford. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we should get rid of landlords. I mean, is there, why don't you think landlords have any motivation to make improvements in terms of the energy efficiency of the structures that they own? You know, there's got to be.
Because they pass the cost on directly to the renters. They don't have to, they suffer no decrement because of that. You need a state subsidy for a credit, a tax credit for the landlords that they can pass on the benefit of to the renters. So that's
all
the
right.
issue.
So then
Really
we
a
need to
financial
have
issue.
legislation that rewards the landlord for making these environmental friendly improvements and not passing the cost on. They're going to save money on, well, let's say they don't have the residents pay for the utilities. There are landlords who the utilities are included within the rent. So they'd obviously save if they reduce the amount of electricity or gas and whatever that's used to heat and power the unit, you know.
It's a
But
long
anyways,
term.
what is the legislation that you are pushing? What is it proposing to do?
It's proposing to have Mass Save and the, what's it called, the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council take into account the externality cost of fossil fuels when they decide whether they would subsidize the conversion from a gas furnace to a heat pump. Right now, they don't take that into account. They take that, and there's a bill, House 2500, which allows that to be taken into account. It's in the conference committee right now. So it's very nerdy details that you have to get into to make this thing happen. And landlords have no incentive, but I have no problem providing landlords with an economic incentive to do that because the long-term benefit is so great. And also landlords should understand, and tenants should understand, that if I have a green building without gas, which is a pollutant and is explosive, I can market that property a lot better to renters than someone who hasn't made that change. So there's a whole marketing dynamic involved with this that we have to be sensitive to. But you got 1 million dwellings in Massachusetts that have knob and tube wiring that need to get rid of before you put insulation, before you can start reducing your heat bill.
Hmm?
So all of you get on the bandwagon, talk to your legislator to start going ahead and changing the tune here.
Any other thoughts or questions that people want to share? I love the passion in this room.
Nia, how do you stay so positive? I mean, I was about to fall off my chair a couple times, during your presentation, and what gives you hope and keeps you going?
There's a couple of things that give me hope. So one, I think I'm a born pain in the butt and I just don't know how to give up. I think that's part of it, is for sure. But I think another is I get really inspired by the youth movement. If you see the tenacity with which they are attacking this issue, it's so beautiful because they're like, we're not taking no for an answer. There's
Right.
literally no other option than for you to give us what we need to survive. And when I see that, it just like, I'm like, yeah, I think it's so, speaking just for myself, it's so easy sometimes to get caught up in the day-to-day minutia of life of, this bill and that appointment and this, that, and the other, that sometimes it just feels like, oh, I'll just let this climate thing go for a minute. Like, I just can't. And to hear them be like, no, like there's no backing down. There's no backing down. There's no planet B. There's no other option. This is it. When I see that, I'm like, yeah, you're right. All right, whew, wake up. Let's do this. Come on. You're right. So the youth movement is like, it keeps the feet to the fire because they're not slowing down for a minute. And I mean, I've heard so many youth say things like, well, if you're not ready to move, get ready to be run over because the movement's happening. So I think that's really great. And I think that the third thing that keeps me going is the fact that I know that there are solutions. I think that people get stuck in the stuff that's bad, but there are solutions. We can do things. We can do things. In fact, if we make big changes to the way we use our land and we simultaneously reduce emissions, we can actually reverse. We can actually sink the extra carbon that we've put out, which is something no one ever talks about. But that's actually possible. We can actually take back some of the carbon that we released. So it's reversible. Not to say that we're going to necessarily get back the habitats that have been lost and the lives that are gone, but we can not just reduce the amount of carbon we're releasing, we can actually reduce the amount that's in the atmosphere. So people just need to get on it. And so that's why I stay positive, because I'm just like, it's not hopeless. It just means we have to commit as a species to our survival.
One of the blessings of COVID is that we saw when everybody stopped, the global stopwatch was clicked, everyone stopped, and the earth started to heal. So it can happen, but everybody's got to be on board. I'd be interested to see what people are going to do, where they're going to invest the stranded assets when more and more people, companies stop investing in fossil fuel. There's going to be trillions of dollars in stranded assets that can go toward some of the things that Tom Golden's going to go forward on the Green Recovery Task Force, creating the jobs, getting the technology going and the communications, tapping into this brilliant resource of young people. And no, failure is not an option. And once everybody shifts into that mode, there's nothing we can't do. I was born without rights and I have them now. We can change things if we want to.
Yep. And one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is the need to invest in education. there's not a single country in the world that requires climate education for its youth. Not a one, which I think is crazy. You know, I actually know of a youth organization that just started up actually in the Cape, and they've gone statewide. And one of the things they're strongly advocating for is that climate change be taught in the schools at a young age, because people don't even know. Like, it's amazing to think that we've been talking about this for decades and there's still people who don't actually have the facts. And if people don't have the facts, how can they make changes? Like, we need to make sure that our young people are educated. Every child should be coming out of school with a really solid climate literacy base. And we should be centering climate change in every conversation. When we're talking to youth about the future of their jobs, whether they want to be a doctor or an engineer or a painter, we should be centering climate in their future work, so that they're thinking about how their work is going to lend itself. I mean, when I think about the green jobs opportunity, I'm like, if we were doing this right, every future job would be a green job. And if it can't be, it should be a job that should be eliminated. Ed.
Yeah, someone mentioned stranded assets. You should be aware to the gas distribution system in Massachusetts is decrepit. There are more leaks each year than are repaired each year. It costs billions of dollars to replace that system. Those same billions of dollars be put into insulating houses, changing the wiring, and building in heat pumps, air source, ground loop, geothermal microdistricts, which are being promoted right now as a solution to some of the Lawrence issues. It's a $4 million out of the settlement with between Columbia and Eversource is being dedicated to putting together a prototype for a geodistrict microdistrict in Lawrence. And you know, we're going to pay for that cost of replacement of the gas leak system, the gas pipes. So I'd much rather go ahead and spend that money and put it into clean and renewable energy systems rather than have us ratepayers pay that type of money. So that's what you're faced with. And not everyone in Massachusetts is on gas. I think there are something like 800,000 dwelling units in Massachusetts that still use coal, oil, propane. The rest of most of the others are of the 2.9 million dwelling units are on gas or electricity, or some are on, some very few are on solar thermal. So there's an opportunity here, and it creates jobs. It's a great job creator. Think of, you got Solarized Massachusetts, which allowed companies to go into a town and convert and install solar systems on houses. Well, we ought to have an Insulized Massachusetts or Electricized Massachusetts, and have the same types of programs that deal with not just one house at a time, but a whole set of row houses at a time. The cost will go down from $8,000 a house to $4,000 or $5,000 a house. I mean, it's doable. And it's a question of why spend billions of dollars on replacing a decrepit gas system when that same money could be used, if we could find a mechanism to do it, to create that conversion. It's a real exciting challenge. We have a real opportunity ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to be smart about it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Ed, do you happen to belong to a local climate group? Need you?
Yeah, I'm involved with the Gas Leaks Allies. You can look that up on Google. I work with a company called HEAT. It's a nonprofit that has developed the geothermal microdistricts. And
Oh, wait,
also
I
I'm
didn't
on the
catch that.
legislative team, Mothers on Front.
I'm sorry, your voice kind of disappeared in and out. Do you want to put that in the chat? Just because I'm interested.
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
no, as you were talking, I thought about all the homes that are in the city that need new windows. That would help a lot too, to keep people warmer. These are things we've done in our house, so I know, but just having some new energy efficient windows would be helpful, and doors.
And I'm glad, Ed, that you brought up the whole Columbia Gas thing, because I think, that happened. I was affected by it. I was without heat for 3 months.
Oh.
Yeah, it was awful. No heat, no stove for 3 months. It was really so, and was not, I had to leave my house for a while. And I was one of the lucky ones, because there were people who were living in trailers for much longer than that. And no one ever talks about that being a climate refugee issue, but it was. That was directly related to the fact that we are stuck on using fossil fuels. And it's dangerous, and it's antiquated, and it cost a life, and it destroyed property, and it left people without homes. And we need to be thinking about that. Like, our commitment to fossil fuels is dangerous.
Imagine your great-grandchildren coming to you and saying, "What? You had natural gas piped into your house? That's explosive."
Exactly.
It's pretty scary when you think about that. Wow.
It was terrifying. I remember coming, like, I had gone out that day, and I had just gotten home from work, and I came in the house, and I was like, something's not right. And I knew something was wrong. And then I looked outside, and I started seeing all these people, and I walked out my door, and they were like, they're evacuating our neighborhood. You have to leave. And I grabbed the cat and grabbed the cat.
You had to go back later to get your partner.
My partner took care of themselves, but I got the cat. and we had to leave. And I remember walking out the house, and as we were packing up the car, ash was falling from the sky, and I could see flames just licking up in the background. I was like, it was like images you see on TV, like Armageddon. I was like, what's
Armageddon.
Oh.
Hey, Nia, I have a thought. We know if the power that generates the electricity, if that's from green, renewable sources, there'll be less injustice, climate injustice, but there still will, how do we prevent there being some? I mean, there are some scenarios, these huge solar farms, they're not going to build them on top of rich people's houses, I mean, in their neighborhoods. So going forward, how do we think about preventing the injustice happening again when we build the new green economy?
That is such a good question. And so one of the things that I have been just recently talking with one of our interns about is the going back to policies again, like thinking big picture, is we really need to start having governments implement policies that require solar batteries to be recycled. Right now, they are not, and they are a waste product that most often ends up in the global south, as much of our waste products do. And so becomes another environmental justice issue. So it very much like you were saying, Thomas, one of those things where the people with the money and access get the benefit of the green energy, and then the downside of it ends up with the people who are always ends up with our trash. So we need to start thinking about making policies that requires the technology to be sustainable, and we need to be forcing people to be able to recycle those things so they don't get just thrown away and producing more garbage. And then I think another piece is that we have to start rethinking our city infrastructures and how we can localize our energy sourcing, because I think right now our grid is designed on mass production that gets piped out. But if we can think about localizing energy sources where small, buildings and towns can produce their things locally, then we can talk about reducing the size of the grid. And then that way you don't have communities having to share the burden and other communities getting the benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you for that. You know, I think it'd be really great if people start to see it, it's their civic duty to produce, you know, green energy if they can, you know, on their own rooftop. You know, so many people still just don't see it. It's like, oh, it's ugly. You know, I mean, that's so lame. You know?
It's lame.
I know. Yeah. It's when people say things like, "Well, it's ugly." I'm like, yeah. Well, you know, like torrential storms are ugly.
Oh, yeah.
We got used to television antennas back in the 50s and 60s. Everybody had those ugly television antennas.
You can get used to anything, right?
That's right.
So
Yeah.
I think do we how much more time do we have?
3 minutes?
What time is it?
3 minutes more?
Time
Alright.
flies.
Wow. It's at 8:30 almost. Oh dear.
Yeah.
Are there any other?
I have one comment in response to Tom's comment, and that is there is a bill in conference committee right now. It's House 4933, which has environmental justice provisions in it. And the thrust of that bill is that if you have an environmental justice community which has a certain level of pollution, before you can put anything more in that community, you have to take into account the historic pollution in the community, unlike the Weymouth compressor station, where that was not the law. If that was the law, then the Weymouth compressor station probably wouldn't have been able to be built. So that's being put in there. So you have to call your legislator to make sure they talk to the conference committee members to get that part of environmental justice legislation passed. It's very important. If you speak up, call your legislature. It just takes 5 or 6 calls from one of the constituents to make the move. So we got what, 16 people left on this committee? I mean, make the calls to your legislator, and you'll start having a voice.
And I want to add to that, something I was really unaware of until like the last few years is how infrequently politicians actually hear from their constituents. Like they almost never actually hear from their constituents. So when you do reach out to them, they really do actually pay attention because they don't hear from people very often. So if you do make a call, you'll be surprised. Like I have had so many people who have told me like, I called because I thought like I didn't expect to even have anybody pick up the phone. And like my representative actually talked to me, like actually answered the phone and spoke to me. They don't hear from their constituents, so they do care. So if you're thinking my call won't make a difference, I'll be 1 in a million, you're probably 1 in a dozen, and
Right.
your call won't make a difference. So
Right.
make the call.
Yeah, actually, can I just say, oh, am I muted? No.
No.
That's a good point to make, because one of the things, kind of scary in a way, Byrne was saying he called, I don't remember which rep it was, Byrne, that you called,
Tom
but
Golden.
you left a message and he called you right back. And I thought, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I'd be like, I'd be speechless. I wouldn't know what to say if he called me right back.
Well, think how speechless I was the other day driving my car, and I got a call from Doreen, Tom Golden's chief of staff, you know, saying he'd like to have a listening session next week. And are you interested? Yeah.
Well, we need to bring Ed on that call too. We've got to get in touch with you, Ed, so you can come with our group.
Bring Nia too.
Tom Golden's critical here. You got to get to Tom Golden and
Okay.
Caleb his aide and talk to him about that.
Yeah. He's on the conference committee.
Yes, he is.
Right.
He's got
Yeah,
a split.
both of the conference committee chairs are Chelmsford legislators. So we're at the kind of cross current of both Tom Golden and Barrett.
And Mike Barrett, yeah.
Them are legislators here. So to build on what Tom was saying, Tom and maybe a few others of us are going to talk to the Green Recovery, what is it, Green Recovery
Task force.
Task force.
on Wednesday, and they're going to be looking for possible programs that both can jumpstart the COVID economy and also be green. So, so a little homework for you all is what can you think of along those lines which we can bring up with them?
I think the EJ, as they call it, the environmental justice, has to be part of that. So we do need to remember to do that.
Right.
Especially,
Like right away, I thought of, there was an article just the other day about this biomass plant being built in Springfield. And, given we're, when we come out of COVID, anything that would, exacerbate respiratory illness in at-risk populations should not be done. So some of this Green Recovery Task Force should be, what should they do? But hey, what should you not do?
Yeah.
As well.
right.
Absolutely.
I
But
just
if you had
think
the
like,
EJ provisions passed, that Springfield plant would never get off the ground. Because it's,
Yeah, I just put a question in the chat wondering, is there a local group that's fighting to support the Springfield community, similar to the way Frax was supporting, against the Weymouth compressor station?
I don't know.
the answer is yes. I'll tell you in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a League of Women Voters is against biomass. There is Mothers Out Front. We had a meeting today where we talked about what we're going to do about opposing the Springfield plant. You have to remember that Massachusetts has some of the best advanced biomass regulations that exist across the country. They've been lauded in federal court opinions across the country as the strictest. And now we have this governor here who wants to go ahead and get this plant built in Springfield, who wants to weaken the biomass regulations, undercut that work that took forever to go ahead and do. So there's a report on this called the Manomet, M-A-N-O-M-E-T study, which talks about the benefits and the upsides and downsides of biomass and the carbon contribution of it. So basically, this proposed legislation to have biomass be renewable energy or be classified as renewable energy is setting us back 12 years.
Just for municipals, which is why it's
Right.
Springfield.
And it's actually the legislation just applies to municipals, which is Springfield. So it's a tailored piece of legislation lobbied for specifically by the people and legislators behind the Springfield plant. And you should take a look at the political donations to those legislators to see where they come from. You can look that up in the Secretary of State's office.
wow.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have for tonight's discussion. I do want to let Nia Keith go if she has to, or if anybody else has any last comments or questions before we sign off tonight. This was a really amazing discussion, and I have recorded it, so I will share this with everybody. But yeah, I want to offer any time for anybody to share any last comments if they have any.
Yes, everyone wants to go ahead and share their emails. Everyone wants to go ahead and communicate with each other and share their emails, either give them to Jessica or give them to Nia and give her permission to send it around to everyone else. So we can keep this conversation up, because this is really a critical, this is a wonderful conversation. Nia, you did a fabulous job.
Yeah, thank you so
Wonderful.
much, Nia. That
Thank
was
you
amazing.
so much.
It was a really great presentation. And I do have everyone's emails, and if you're interested, on November 12th at 1 p.m., the Climate Conversations group meets again through the Chelmsford Library on Zoom, and I will send out that link to anyone who registers on the Chelmsford Library's calendar. So that's chelmsfordlibrary.org, and then you can just click on the events calendar and sign up for the Climate Conversations meeting. And then going forward, as long as we're virtual, we will have, you can use that link to connect to that meeting.
Every month. Yeah, the speaker is Melissa Joyce, who is the town's sustainability director. I think is her title. Yeah.
Yep.
Did Nia already leave?
I think she just jumped out, yeah.
Oh, okay. Uh-oh. Well, I have her email. I'll send her a thank you from everybody. But yeah. All right. Well, so Ed, if in anyone else, if you want to get emails from our group, from the Chelmsford Climate Action Team, you could give them to Byrne or to me tonight or Jessica, and we can include you on our mailing list. We've kind of got together about, I don't know, how many months ago did we form? In January, and then the pandemic changed a lot of things, but we do try to get together, and we hope to see what we can do in Chelmsford working with Melissa, our sustainability person. And so we need more ideas and people to help. We're hoping to figure out how many, what our greenhouse gas, our emissions are here in Chelmsford, and try to lower them by 2050. Maybe we can do it sooner, but that's just one of the many projects. Tom, you want to just mention the aggregation program quickly, because I know we don't have much time.
Well, green municipal aggregation. We want to really promote opting up to greener options. We have 2 now. Hey, Ed, are you familiar with ECA?
Elders Climate Action?
Yes, yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I attend some of their stuff and participate in some of their programs.
Okay, great. Because, you know, yeah.
Representative Jones is part of Chelmsford in his district, doesn't he?
Jones.
Brad Jones? Doesn't he include? Okay.
Doesn't ring a bell.
You're split between Tom Golden and Chelmsford, between Tom Golden and someone else has a piece of Chelmsford, doesn't it?
And James Asiero.
That's right. That's right.
And Tammy Gouveia.
Tammy Gouveia, yeah, I've known her.
And soon to be gone. What was his name? Nagel?
Nagel, yeah. He covers lower places too. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I love the historical story of Chelmsford. I have to use that word Chelmsford because someone who grew up in Chelmsford told me that. And that is many, many years ago, decades ago.
Taped it.
Uh-huh.
It was a town that was really really controlled by Dutch farmers, and all the Dutch farmers owned all the land around, and so someone wanted to put in zoning, so they put in zoning in the center of the town and didn't zone the Dutch farmers' land, and then the Dutch farmers were selling all those land to the big industries that went ahead and made a bundle by selling the land to the big companies that developed the outside farmland around Chelmsford. So it's really an interesting story. Interesting history.
I have to say one thing. I put a link in for the Chelmsford Climate Action Team. Is chelmsfordclimate.org. And if anyone's interested, please click on that. You can contact any of us through that. There's an email link on there too. And it's been a very good collection of folks here. More than half of you don't come from Chelmsford Climate Action. So we'd like to stay in contact somehow, and that's one way to do it.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Jessica.
I got the chat. Thank you so much, Jess.
Appreciate it.
Thank you all
Okay.
so much.
Hey,
I'm
time
really-
to watch the debate.
I
Yes.
know, we've got to go
that's
and
great.
watch this crazy debate now.
Let us pray.
Thank you
Let
all.
us all pray. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank
Good
you so
night.
much for joining us. And
Good
I'll
to
email
see
you
everyone.
Bye.
bye.
Bye, Jess. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Kathy.